or more accurately, don't happen in the Indian diaspora. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, the great Dalit rights activist, famously said that if Indians migrate to other countries in the world, caste will become a world problem. And that is exactly what we are seeing today in the United States. Casteism, the world's oldest system of discrimination, has found its way into the nation's largest tech companies and most well-known universities. And unsurprisingly, this casteism is fueled by diaspora Hindus who are sympathetic to or even supportive of Hindutva, also known as Hindu extremism. Thanks to the tireless work of Dalit activists, we've seen some landmark court cases challenging caste discrimination in the United States. In 2020, the state of California sued tech giant Cisco and 2 of its employees for allegedly discriminating against a Dalit engineer. And in January of 2022, California State University, the largest public university system in the United States, passed a resolution to add caste as a category of discrimination after a study conducted by the advocacy organization Equality Labs found that 1 in 3 Dalit students reported discrimination in educational settings. But similar to the way white supremacists, push back against affirmative action by claiming victimhood, certain right-wing Hindu groups are now attempting to strip away caste protections through false claims of anti-Hindu discrimination. 2 Cal State University professors are currently suing the university system under these claims, saying that the new policy seeks to define the Hindu religion as including caste as an alleged oppressive and discriminatory system as foundational religious tenets. That is a very loaded statement, but today we're going to break that down. We're joined by a panel of experts to talk about this argument, the entire Cal State case, and the harsh realities of caste discrimination in the USA and outside of India. Let us jump into this discussion right after we play a brief video with this week's Genocide News Roundup.
Human Rights Commission to help fulfill its mandate fully in line with the Paris Principles, and 4.
Several countries, including the United States, Canada, Britain, China, Germany, Saudi Arabia, Australia, and Switzerland urged India to take a tougher stand on growing sexual violence and religious discrimination at its Universal Periodic Review in the UN Human Rights Council. The U.S. ambassador to the Council, Michelle Taylor, recommended that India reduce the broad application of draconian laws like the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act against human rights activists, journalists, and religious minorities.
Prevention Act and similar laws against human rights activists, journalists, and religious minorities.
India appreciates the role played by human rights defenders, civil society groups, and journalists.
India's Solicitor General Tushar Mehta openly defended and even praised some of India's most authoritarian human rights crackdowns at the UN Human Rights Council during the Universal Periodic Review of India.
At the same time, the activities of the human rights defenders should be in conformity with the law of the land. Now coming to the issue regarding Jammu and Kashmir.
Mehta backed the stripping of Kashmiri's semi-autonomous status, the discriminatory anti-conversion laws, and the Citizenship Amendment Act by falsely stating that neither posed a threat to minorities.
The Citizenship Amendment Act CAA 2019 is concerned.
A high court in Uttar Pradesh state dismissed a petition against the acquittal of senior leaders of the Hindu right-wing Bharatiya Janata Party and other Hindu supremacists over their involvement in the demolition of the historic Babri Mosque in 1992 and the large-scale anti-Muslim violence that followed.
53 years का बूढ़ा एक 6 साल की लड़की से शादी करता है निकाह.
Telangana High Court ordered the release of anti-Muslim hate-monger and BJP lawmaker Raja Singh, who was arrested in August after he made derogatory comments about Prophet Muhammad. Singh had posted an offensive video against Prophet Muhammad, triggering massive protests demanding his arrest. Karnataka High Court Chief Justice Ritu Rajawasti, who was part of a bench that upheld the ban on hijabs in schools and colleges in the state, has been appointed as the chairperson of the 22nd Law Commission that has been constituted after more than 4 years. The Law Commission advises the union government on legal reforms. A Karnataka court ruled in favor of a demand made by the violent Hindu supremacist group Vishwa Hindu Parishad, allowing them to conduct a survey on the 800-year-old Malali Mosque in Mangaluru city. The group has falsely claimed that remnants of a Hindu temple are located in the mosque. The Bharatiya Janata Party ruled Union Ministry of Home Affairs has announced a move to give citizenship rights to Hindus, Sikhs, Buddhists, Jains, Parsis, and Christians hailing from Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Afghanistan, living in 9 states across India. Muslims whose families have been living in India are denied similar citizenship rights outright.
अब मैं फातिमा बा हूँ, एक आईसिस टेररिस्ट इन अफगानिस्तान जेल, और मैं अकेली नहीं।
A formal demand to ban an upcoming Bollywood movie, The Kerala Story, has been lodged with India's Federal Ministry of Information and Broadcasting. The film has been slammed by journalists, activists, and filmmakers for peddling overtly anti-Muslim propaganda through its blatantly false claim that over 30,000 Hindu women were converted to Islam and made to join the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria.
That was this week's Human Rights News Roundup from India. But now we're going to talk about Cal State and casteism in the United States with our very first panelist, Dolly Arjun, a physician associate, cultural activist, and co-founder at Rural Health India. Dolly, we're so happy for you to join us today. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Safa, for the introduction. My name is Dolly, like Safa mentioned, and thank you so much, everyone, for attending this briefing to learn more about these efforts, where we will discuss the backlash to recently won protections against caste discrimination. It's first important to understand the many forms that caste discrimination takes and how it's traveled from South Asia into the American diaspora. For starters, the caste system originates in Hinduism, which, to be more historically accurate, is Brahmanism. And caste is a way of dividing human beings and is used to keep groups deemed inferior by the system out of legal, health, education, political, and private industry. It's a system of graded hierarchy, and at the very top are Brahmins, and at the very bottom are a community referred to as Dalits, and they are those considered untouchables in the caste system. And unlike its connotation in American English, untouchable refers to the fact that if an upper caste person is exposed to our touch or our shadow, they become spiritually and physically polluted. It's so demeaning and humiliating a system that we are placed in the category below the communities considered slaves in the caste hierarchy. Casteism and caste culture, which is probably what you might think of when you think of Indian culture, is not only practiced in South Asia, it's practiced everywhere South Asians immigrate to, including in the US. So historically, the scriptures prescribe that upper caste, or rather I'm going to refer to them as oppressor castes, are the only ones that should have access to education, healthcare, and resources such as land ownership. And that spiritual and religious capital has translated into economic capital in modern day societies. And that, combined with US immigration policies, led to the oppressor caste communities becoming an overwhelming majority of the South Asian immigrants in the US. So naturally, caste networks and caste practices from back home have been transported to the US. One way caste persists in the US is through popularized mainstream like culture, what we consider culture, and caste culture is anti-democratic, it is anti-people, and built into it is the genocidal framework against Dalit and Adivasi people. For example, Diwali, which is a festival growing in popularity in the US, is a reference to the murder and killing of Dalit and indigenous people. But because DEI culture doesn't understand that, HR wishes all of us a happy Diwali every year now. This is also because oppressor castes have learned how to benefit from social justice languaging, benefiting from equity policies in the US. The head of any major health, education, or political organization in the US that is South Asian will almost invariably be a Brahmin. If we look at food practices, then Indian food has become synonymous with vegetarianism or a taboo against eating beef, which is something that Dalit and Muslim communities have historically done, and they are lynched in India for doing so. This is caste culture. Exercises like yoga are also a means to spread caste culture. Yoga studios teach concepts like karma and dharma, and both are used to justify the caste system. Another popular caste culture expert is Gandhi, known as a hero here, but he was an ardent supporter of the caste system, and he single-handedly disempowered the untouchable community more than any white British colonialist. And when I say Dalit and Adivasi, it includes those of us who have converted to Christianity or Islam to escape the caste system. This is why there is a threat of genocide against religious minorities in India, because caste culture is threatened by it. You know how they say follow the money? Well, with Indians, you follow the caste. Political organizations from India have capitalized on this caste culture to build formalized institutions that now threaten to interfere in US democracy in insidious ways. Besides a Cisco case, which you'll hear about, there's also the case of the temple construction in New Jersey. The New York Times covered a story about Dalit workers that were essentially trafficked here to work under grueling conditions, unable to return home. Under the caste system, this exploitation is totally normal. Caste networks here operate as nonprofits and fund right-wing extremist political contribution organizations in India. For example, Sewa International, to which many of you might have contributed money during the pandemic, raises millions of dollars every year, which news reports suggest is sent to organizations affiliated with the Hindu supremacist RSS used to radicalize Hindus. Ekal Vidyalay, which is a nonprofit based in the US, also raises money under the guise of educating rural children. But research also indicates that it's part of the same RSS network working to radicalize children. So transparency and anti-discrimination policies in international spaces in the US are among our only chance to expose the depth and breadth of this centuries-long injustice, because as you saw in the video Safa just played, there's just an outright denial about everything that's going on. And protections against caste discrimination is crucial for us to maintain. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dolly. I think I speak as a member of the Indian diaspora who is not very familiar with the ins and outs of caste discrimination. I think you summarized it beautifully, so thank you for that. Our next speaker is Mr. Anil Wagde, an activist at Ambedkar International Center, a civil rights advocacy group formed in 2012 to fight against caste discrimination in the United States. Anil, floor is yours.
Thank you. And Jai Bhim. If Hindus migrate to other regions on earth, Indian caste would become a world problem. You heard this earlier on, and sorry for repeating. This is from History of Caste in India over a century ago. Over 85% of the 4 million Indians in the United States are from oppressor caste. Cisco caste discrimination case has proved this unwanted import is indeed here in the United States. I will talk about a few instances of how the caste is operating here in the US. I have spoken about caste at Seattle Tech Workers Union, at Washington State University, New Jersey Civil Rights Department, and hence I was introduced to a multinational aerospace company to talk about caste during Diversity Week. I was introduced there by a friend who worked there. I was invited to share the outline of my talk to the diversity and HR folks. I shared the presentation that we at Ambedkar International Center have prepared on caste and did a walkthrough. HR did confirm the talk. However, in a few days, I received a call from my friend saying diversity folks would like to go over my talk once again, since there is an objection within HR by a Hindu Brahmin lady. This time there was a full quorum with HR head, the lady who had an objection, and then the entire diversity council was present. This time I again made a full presentation. After I left the meeting, what transpired there was shared by a friend, my friend. The lady who objected said, caste is a taboo subject and we should not talk about it. It divides the society. India's then president was from the erstwhile untouchable caste. She brought this to highlight that caste discrimination doesn't exist. An African American lady, part of the Diversity Council, replied that diversity is about discussing so-called taboo subjects. It is about discussing the issues that divide the society. Society is already divided and we must talk about it so that we are able to bridge the gap. And thirdly, she said, we also had President Barack Obama. Does that mean the racism has disappeared from the United States? With that retort, my presentation was approved. However, as luck would have had it, the HR had left the company, the Hindu Brahmin lady became the head of the Diversity Council, and my talk was shelved. Of course, you must have been aware of the Google caste talk controversy when a caste activist was stopped from giving the talk on the caste. Why I'm talking about this? Erasure of caste, denying caste is the first defense of the casteist. If the caste system is talked about in textbooks, caste supremacists, Brahmins, and other upper caste object vehemently, as seen during the California textbook controversy raging since 2006. At the same time, they are very proud of their caste and are constantly looking for each other's caste to decide whether to include or exclude people in their caste groups. My friend Ram Kumar works at Cisco. A co-worker was very interested in finding his caste. Ram Kumar belongs to the erstwhile untouchable caste and was reluctant to tell his caste. The so-called upper caste wear a so-called sacred thread that one can feel if one taps the left shoulder. This co-worker tapped Ram Kumar's left shoulder to check if Ram Kumar was wearing the thread to ascertain his caste. Ram Kumar turned back and said, "You didn't find, didn't it? Isn't it?" Ram Kumar says now he avoids companies that have more Indians. He has recently filed a complaint with California's Civil Rights Department that a person based in California is sending emails to many Indians and abusing erstwhile untouchables that they are unworthy of human-like treatment, are incapable of doing any work, and should not be hired for jobs. This person goes on to list names belonging to untouchable caste to make it easy to exclude. All this is happening here in the US. Here are some experts from the email talking about how not to hire the untouchable community. Dalits survive, and I'm quoting, Dalits survive in the US through prostitution. Even monkeys perform better than them. He goes on to list names, like I said, to identify Dalits and urges people not to hire them. Caste has arrived with a bang in the US. Unless we take steps, caste cancer will spread in the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Anilji, for that talk. And as well as we're very sorry to hear what happened to your friend. That's a very troubling story. So thank you so much for sharing. I'm now going to move on to our next speaker, Dr. Kevin Brown. And if you'll just give me a moment, I just dropped his bio off the face of the earth. I found it again. Okay. He's a Mitch Willoughby Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of South Carolina School of Law and the Richard S. Melvin Emeritus Professor at Indiana University Moore School of Law. Dr. Brown, floor is yours.
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to talk to you. As most of you know, the California Civil Rights Department, formerly known as the California Department of Fair Employment and Housing, is engaged in a lawsuit in California state courts under the Fair Employment and Housing Act of suing Cisco Systems for discrimination against John Doe Dalit. CRT, California, or the Civil Rights Division, CRT is asserting that John Doe was a victim of caste discrimination, which is a form of discrimination covered by one of the protected traits in California's discrimination law, which include race, religion, ancestry, national origin or ethnicity, and color. In response to this litigation, in September of 2022, the Hindu American Foundation, HAF, filed a complaint with the District Court of the Eastern District of California asserting 1983 claims of violation of its religious rights and argues that claims of discrimination against John Doe violate their religious rights. HAF asserts that such work by CRD is a violation of its free exercise rights, its procedural due process rights, and its equal protection rights. And I've been asked to address the complaints or arguments raised by HAF in their complaint. Now, first off, what HAF notes in its complaint, so this is what HAF says, is that the core of Hinduism lies in its assertion that the divine is equally present in all, and that this divinity is the ultimate eternal omnipresent reality and reflected through immortal individual selves or pure consciousness, which takes form through a cycle of birth and rebirth or reincarnation. Moreover, as a result of this shared divinity, Hinduism asserts a moral obligation to ensure that one's thoughts, words, and actions uphold values like truth, non-injury, compassion, equanimity, generosity, and equal regard in order to honor the divine in all. Half goes on to assert that CRD is actively pursuing religious discrimination enforcement actions against Hindu Americans in California state courts based on an inaccurate colonial assertion that Hindu beliefs and practices include a discriminatory caste system. Half notes that the caste system was actually a product of the creation of British colonial control as opposed to based upon the beliefs of Hindu people. The CRD is actively pursuing religious discrimination enforcement actions based upon this inaccurate view of caste, which the British colonial government latched onto in a way to manifest its control over India. So in this regard, Half makes three arguments. The first is that the action by Cisco violates its free exercise rights. And in this, Half argues that a violation of religious rights exists when you impose special disabilities on the basis of religious status. As Half argues, by CRD asserting the discrimination claims against Cisco, CRD is acting under the color of law to wrongly define Hindu beliefs, teachings, and practices to include the abhorrent practice of caste discrimination. By seeking to define these religious beliefs, CRD is imposing a special disability on the basis of religion by wrongly claiming that Hindus believe in and participate in a discriminatory caste system. Now, the problem with this argument is that factually it's an error. CRD is not seeking to define Hindu religious beliefs, but to prevent caste discrimination. And this is a form of discrimination that is practiced by a variety of religions, including Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and Sikhism. Thus, CRD is not, nor does it need to define Hindu religious beliefs in order to attack caste discrimination. Now, Half also makes a second claim, the equal protection claim. Half asserts that government may not use religion as a basis of classification for the imposition of duties, penalties, privileges, or benefits. Religion is a suspect class, as is national origin. As Half goes on, by wrongly claiming that Hinduism includes a belief in the caste system, by adopting an enforcement position that caste discrimination violates California's Discrimination Act, and by filing enforcement actions that seek to enshrine its wrong and defamatory view of Hindu beliefs into state law, CRD is acting under the color of state law against Hindu Americans. This claim too suffers from an incorrect factual assertion that CRD is asserting that caste is a function of Hinduism. Half does not assert that caste discrimination is a part of Hinduism, but US law is very clear that governments have a compelling interest in the eradication of racial and ethnic discrimination that would in fact override religious beliefs directed towards such discrimination. And then the third claim that Half makes is a due process claim. Half asserts that a law qualifies as unconstitutionally vague, not because it is difficult to prove, but whereas it is unclear as to what the fact must be proved. Seeking to define Hinduism to include the belief and practice in caste and the caste system is so standardless that it would actually require the very discrimination that it seeks to prevent. As Half puts the argument, if CRD is correct, that caste discrimination is practiced as part of religious practice, the fact that caste is not a recognized form of discrimination would require religious accommodation of those who believe in caste discrimination. But this also misstates CRD's position. CRD is not arguing that CRD is arguing that caste discrimination falls under one of the protected traits. So it's either a form of race discrimination, a form of national origin discrimination, a form of color discrimination, a form of religious discrimination, or a form of ancestry discrimination. As such, given CRD's position, anyone who practiced caste discrimination in employment would violate its discrimination rules. In addition, CRD's claim is that Cisco Systems, Inc. engaged in intentional discriminatory conduct towards John Doe the Dalit. Thus, what CRD must prove isn't vague at all. It is that the discriminators engaged in negative employment actions against John Doe, motivated by his belief in caste. I want to finish up with a fourth claim, and this is not a claim that Half makes, but this is a claim that I think would be much stronger than the other three that they have made, and which it would not surprise me if they don't eventually amend their complaint and make this claim. And that would be that by adding the concept of caste to discrimination provisions is a violation of the Establishment Clause, because the only religion that practices caste would be Hinduism. And by targeting caste discrimination, such discrimination laws would be treating the religion of Hinduism worse than any other religion. And government must be neutral with respect to all religions. I think this would be the strongest argument that they could make. But even this argument would not survive the way the Supreme Court has interpreted Establishment Clause challenges. Now, this is actually a form of interpretation that's sort of in the process of changing. Under the older interpretation, in order to make an Establishment Clause change or argument, you would have to prove that the governmental action was either motivated by discriminatory intent against the religion, which this is not, because it's motivated by a desire to eliminate the discrimination based on caste, that it would have an effect of discrimination against a particular religion. And this may be where their argument is strongest, in the notion of saying, hey, look, the effect of this would only be to attack Hindus. And then third, that there would be governmental entanglement with religion, which clearly would not happen here. But the Supreme Court has made it clear that when you're talking about a neutral law of general application, and that's what a law that prohibits discrimination does, it's a general application that applies across all fields, those kinds of laws are deemed to be valid under the Establishment Clause. But that was the older form of interpretation. The Supreme Court, just this past June, seems to be moving to a different form of interpretation of the Establishment Clause, saying that it would only strike down governmental actions that violate the Establishment Clause if those actions were not based on historical practices and understanding. This is where caste discrimination takes on a unique feature here in the US, because arguments that race discrimination in the US was a form of caste discrimination actually goes all the way back to the 1830s. Importantly, the very first anti-discrimination measure that Congress passed, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, that is the Civil Rights Act of 1866, it was very clear that Congress and the American public understood that act as attempting to prevent the creation of the Indian caste system in the US. This was a specific argument made by a number of the framers of the Civil Rights Act of 1866, as well as the 14th Amendment, which is where the constitutional challenges that HAF is making comes from. So if you look at historical practices and understanding, the very definition of American anti-discrimination law was constructed around a desire to prevent the functioning of the Indian caste system. And with that, I will conclude.
Dr. Brown, thank you so much for your insights, as well as that very in-depth breakdown of HAF's arguments. Really appreciate your time and you being here. I'm going to move on now to our next speaker, who is actually joining us through recorded video. So we appreciate Dr. Deepa Sundaram, Professor of Hindu Studies at the University of Denver, for submitting her video remarks. And I will be playing those right now.
Good morning. I open with a positionality statement. I'm Dr. Deepa Sundaram, a professor of Hindu Studies at the University of Denver. As a dominant caste South Asian American from a Hindu background who is cisgendered, able-bodied, and an assistant professor at a prominent institution in the US, I hold several privileges, including those of class, caste, and profession. I also navigate the challenges of being a brown woman and the daughter of immigrants in predominantly white spaces. Award-winning Dalit author and anti-caste activist Yashika Dutt writes, quote, "Caste is the invisible arm that turns the gears in nearly every system in the country," end quote. While she is referring to India, I show how that invisible arm continues to work in the US. My remarks today will focus on three main points. One, caste is a social, cultural, and political hierarchy that continues to proliferate in South Asian and Hindu communities, both within and outside of the Indian subcontinent. Casteism is cultural violence that must be addressed through civil rights protections. Two, the roots of caste practices in the form of varna, literally class or category, and jati, birth group or position, are found in many Brahmanical Hindu texts, such as the Vedas, Laws of Manu, and Bhagavad Gita. Hindus can and do reject these practices. To do so ethically requires acknowledging caste-based practices as part of the tradition and seeking to build more inclusive communities. To suggest caste is not part of Hinduism is deeply problematic, negates the experiences of caste-oppressed groups, and most importantly, is not supported by Hindu Orthodox texts. 3, anti-discrimination policies that include protections against caste discrimination do not harm Hindus specifically or South Asians in general. Rather, they offer an important corrective to bring civil rights protections in the US in line with the protections already afforded to other oppressed groups, and show that privilege and oppression are intersectional and not zero-sum. Caste is a social system that is determined at birth and assigns hierarchical roles to various communities within society. Caste is established and given credence in pre-modern Hindu texts, and other religious communities have adopted discriminatory caste practices as well. Today, caste operates within South Asian communities of all religious backgrounds, and it continues to constrain political, economic, social, and cultural practices, including elected office, managerial positions, marriage, meal sharing, and friendship. In my reading of a recent lawsuit 2 Hindu professors filed against Cal State University for adding caste to its anti-discrimination policies, it seems contradictory that the complainants both wish to argue that caste is not foundational to Hinduism and that Cal State does not have the right to define Hinduism. If one believes caste is not part of Hinduism, then why argue that Cal State's policy banning caste discrimination maligns Hindus? Moreover, Cal State's decision to add caste to their campus-wide anti-discrimination policy was prompted by the testimony of Dalit activists and students, scholars of caste, and allies of caste-oppressed groups. After the policy was approved, Simranjit Singh, executive director of the Inclusive America Project housed at the Aspen Institute, and I wrote an op-ed for Religion News Service explaining why this was a critical first step to dismantling caste discrimination in the US. Here is a brief excerpt. Though we think of caste as an Indian question, it has long been a part of the South Asian immigrant story. In 1920, a US Army veteran named Bhagat Singh Thind applied for citizenship after serving in World War I. Thind's lawyer argued that Thind was a Caucasian and therefore should be granted citizenship. Thind's lawyer tied this claim to Thind's dominant caste status, stating the caste system prevails in India to a degree unsurpassed elsewhere. With this caste system prevailing, there was a comparatively small mixture of blood between the different castes. In other words, Thinn's claim to US citizenship rested on his dominant caste identity and its parallels with whiteness. The US Supreme Court eventually rejected the argument, saying that he did not appear white and therefore couldn't be considered for citizenship. But his attempt to claim whiteness, in part based on his caste identity, shows us an important linkage between caste and race. Both are socially constructed mechanisms for cultural power. It also underscores how long caste has been an operative category of identity in the US. Critics who have opposed Cal State's move, some of whom are affiliated with groups with dominant caste leadership and a history of caste apologists and Hindu nationalist views, argue that non-discrimination policy should not consider caste because the policy would then only apply to one group, South Asians. They further claim that calling attention to caste inequities actually risks creating negative stigmas and endangering an already vulnerable Hindu minority. While it is true that white supremacy harms South Asians, this duplicitous stance obfuscates how power and privilege work. It's possible to discriminate against people who share your South Asian identity while also being marginalized by others for being South Asian. Discrimination is not mutually exclusive or zero-sum. Recognition of casteism in the South Asian diaspora is important because of what it signals to dominant caste groups. They might be racialized and minoritized by virtue of their ethnicity, but they can still have privilege and oppress others based on other identities they hold. In conclusion, extending civil rights protections to caste-oppressed groups does not negate or amplify the harms Hindus suffer from white supremacy or other forms of hate. Rather, it affirms the core values of civil rights as human rights. Protection against caste discrimination recognizes the discrimination that Dalit and caste-oppressed groups face as a civil rights issue. Extending these protections underscores the US's commitment to protection against discrimination in all its forms. Thank you.
That was Dr. Deepa Sundaram, and she'll be joining us for our Q&A session, which we're going to start right now. So for our audience, if you do have any questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we will get to them as they come in. I'm just going to start off by asking our panelists to turn their cameras on so I can start asking you some of our pre-prepared questions as well. And I'm going to start off with one for Dolly. This is something that I don't think we fully touched on in our presentations so far, but how do you respond to arguments by that some right-wing Hindus are making now more and more vocally, that caste is a colonial construct and not one that is inherently part of Hinduism?
Well, that's historically inaccurate. And actually, what is a colonial construct is Hinduism is a colonial construct. The word Hinduism doesn't present itself in any religious text prior to British colonization or in any text at all. Like that's part of scripture. And really that's why I mentioned that it's really better to refer to it as Brahmanism, because it's a system of graded hierarchy where the Brahmins are at the top. And so just so I don't get too off topic. And there's actually a lot of testimonies by people from the community that have written about the discrimination that they have faced. Mukta Salve is one young woman who during, I think she might have written during maybe British colonial times about her experience being a young, untouchable woman. And there's a lot of historical references. You'll find that Dalit people were forced to wear like ceramic, like utensils around their necks so that they could spit into that, that if their shadows had fallen on anybody, that there was repercussions for that. And you also find a lot of historical photographs showing Dalit people who don't have access to water being forced to receive water through a can transmitted through this pipe. So there's just too much history to claim that caste is some kind of British colonial invention. And not only that, but actually British colonialists doubled down on that by privileging Brahmin communities. And Brahmins are actually the ones who held a lot of these posts, like commander level posts in whatever area. And that's why we see the historical migration of upper caste communities first, because we didn't have access to it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Because this is an argument I've seen being floated, not just among more established right-wing Hindu groups, but also young Gen Z Hindus as well. So it's interesting to hear your take on this, or the historical take on this, rather. As a follow-up question, what about claims? Yes.
I think Dr. Brown also wants to comment on this.
Oh, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, please. Thank you for this opportunity to comment on this, because this is really a very complicated question. In some sense, it's a simple question, but in some sense, it's complicated. It's complicated because we're dealing with a South Asian community. It's a very global community that is primarily used to dealing with the concept of caste as it was understood in South Asia. The question for the American legal system about caste is radically, fundamentally different from the arguments about caste discrimination in the international context or in India. For us, the striking thing about this is that the history of the understanding of caste as a foundational idea in American anti-discrimination law goes all the way back to the very beginning. Even today, you will hear African-American scholars talk about how we are treated as if we are a caste. The notion of borrowing the caste language goes all the way back to 1830s. So for purposes of legal fights, legal disputes, the question of whether or not the caste system fits within American notions of discrimination are defined by the way caste was used in the United States. And in the United States, the analogy of the treatment of Blacks by whites to the caste system was a fundamental analogy that was used throughout. Effectively, American anti-discrimination law was built upon the notion that we want to prevent the caste system that developed in India. So with respect to the argument of whether or not the British created caste or didn't create caste, that's really, from the standpoint of American law, irrelevant. The relevant question will be, did that individual take their discriminatory actions motivated by a belief in the caste of the victim who they are discriminating against? That's the only real legal question. So whether caste is something that's 5,000 years old or 200 years old, important question. And you're not going to be able to read caste out of American anti-discrimination law without collapsing American anti-discrimination law.
Dr. Brown, thank you so much for that insight. I think that speaks a lot to how much the civil rights movement in the United States, as well as Dalit rights movements in India, have influenced each other. So I appreciate you bringing up that conversation. Anilji, go ahead if you'd like to comment on this as well. We'd love to hear your thoughts.
Just two quick comments. On one hand, they say that the Mahabharata, the Ramayana are very ancient text wherein caste is, and Gita and so on, the caste is very directly mentioned there. What British did is documenting the caste. They literally took pains, did the census across the Indian subcontinent and listed it down. So just because British documented it doesn't mean that they invented it. It existed for the ancient time, for 2,000 years or 2,000 to 5,000 years. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Actually, that's a really important point that you mentioned. I think to kind of jump off of this conversation, from a legal standpoint, this case, we've discussed how this Cal State case doesn't hold water. However, do you as our panelists feel that this case, as it progresses, will open up necessary conversations about caste to the American public, or is the American public a bit too uninformed about what caste is, or the wide-reaching effects of caste for this to be a productive conversation? And I open this up to any one of you.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I'll jump on this in terms of really, as I think about Cisco and why Cisco is so critical as a case. Although Cisco is actually under California law, so it's not under federal law. In other words, this is not a Title VII discrimination case or a Title VI discrimination case. But what Cisco suggests, and I think we the lawyers and scholars who've been looking at this really do think that there is really something called caste discrimination that does exist and is covered by law. Once you come to that legal conclusion, and while we as lawyers think it's the case and as professors we think it's the case, you really have to have legal decisions by courts that say it. But once the courts go down that path, it's not just that caste becomes a form of discrimination under California's discrimination law, but the argument's going to be that it's a form of discrimination under Title VII. And if it's a form of discrimination under Title VII, then it means all employers subject to Title VII have to now take this seriously because they can become defendants in lawsuits that are pushing caste. But more importantly than Title VII, which deals only with employment law, Title VII comes from the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Title VI of the 1964 Civil Rights Act would use the same definition of discrimination, and that would apply to all federal contractors, meaning anyone who's taking money from the federal government would now be under an obligation not to discriminate based on caste. That's all of your colleges and universities throughout the entire country, but it would also impact contracts that are coming from private corporations as well as government corporations. So a finding of a legal conclusion that caste discrimination is included under Title VII or Title VI cannot help but substantially increase the discussions of caste, because now all of a sudden, all of these entities which have ignored it or haven't worried about it are all of a sudden in a certain legal jeopardy if they don't deal with it.
So in essence, we're going to be forced to have this conversation whether we like it or not. Amazing. Okay, Anil ji and Dolly ji, and I see Dr. Sundaram has also joined us. Welcome. Do any of you want to chime in on this as well?
Yeah, so this is kind of a complex question, right? And given that we're talking about this in the US context, where white supremacy or kind of like in this context here, we're talking about whiteness being at the top, there's multiple layers to this, right? So there's South Asians, kind of like Dr. Sundaram had mentioned in her talk about how there's the reality that South Asians are both a minority in the community, but then they also come from upper caste communities who are oppressive. And a friend of mine recently, an upper caste friend recently said to me that like, who is very much aligned with Black Lives Matter, which is great. And a lot of the South Asian activists, social justice folks are super aligned with Black Lives Matter, but they don't ever acknowledge their roles being upper, like their oppressor caste nature when it concerns South Asia. And they might not even have any friends who are Dalit or know any people. I would say that really because of a lot of the activism happening in the past 5 years in the US, there's a little bit more awareness, but most upper caste people will only know Dalit people from back home in the form of their servants, their maids, their drivers. So they don't even have relationships with Dalit people, but here they are in the US saying Black Lives Matter. So is that bad? No, I'm great that Black leadership has this allyship from other communities. But first of all, it's obviously so ingenuine. And what happens when oppressor caste communities take up these equity positions, or they're saying both Black Lives Matter, but also denying caste discrimination. So that's become a huge problem for us as the Dalit community, who obviously we also align. And so there are oftentimes I see that South Asian activists are taking up spaces in these conversations. In terms of white people, they're obviously more likely to kind of listen to this caste issue because it doesn't implicate them directly. And they might not always align with the conversation around how Black lives should matter. But in some ways, we as Dalit people, we're having to toe the line between how do we gain allyship in the US, where can we talk about this and also talk about it authentically without having oppressor caste communities kind of dwarf the whole conversation by making it about them because they're minorities in the US. And I'm sorry if that wasn't very clear, but I'm hoping more Deepa and Anil will also add to this.
Not at all. I think that was a great contribution. Anilji or Dr. Sundaram, would you like to chime in on this?
I'll briefly say that I agree completely with Dolly's comments, and thank you. I thought you were very clear. I would just add one thing, which I briefly talked about. No, I didn't. I'm sorry, I didn't talk about, but I have a piece coming out this week or next week that's going to be talking about it. The other piece of this is that not only do dominant caste and Savarnas quite often, sort of have this cognitive dissonance where on the one hand, they're supporting social justice movements in the US while actually participating sometimes very actively in caste discrimination or passively, and either way, right? But we also see Hindu right-wing organizations in the US leveraging anti-racist and decolonial frameworks to sort of, enshrine Hindus as what I call a perennially vulnerable community. So no matter where they are or what they are, they're always vulnerable, right? And so this makes it really challenging to, for example, the kinds of conversations I've had with elected officials about, especially white elected officials, if I can be so blunt, they are so afraid of being called racist that they're able to sort of fall victim to this kind of messaging, right? When, for example, I saw somebody posted about Hindu phobia, and I'll briefly comment on that. When somebody, for example, accuses somebody of Hindu phobia and then they call that racism, right? Then, immediately you have an entire camp of people that are going to be like, oh yeah, we don't want to be called racist. And we saw this in New Jersey with the bulldozer incident. We saw this with the way that Democratic politicians responded to this. We saw this with the Dismantling Global Hindutva conference and the way that Democratic politicians responded to this. There's a real literacy issue. And I think that part of the problem is that we watch organizations that are supposed to represent Hindus, and I put that in scare quotes because I don't feel like they represent a lot of Hindu views. I think there's a lot of diversity there. But they tend to leverage these social justice frameworks that are intended to be liberatory to enshrine illiberal and frankly violent policies and really shroud Islamophobia and casteism from any kind of real critique and being addressed. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sundaram. I actually do want to follow up with that, just to talk a bit more in depth on the defense of Hindu phobia. Could you talk a little bit more about the ways in which Hindu phobia is used as a shield to defend Hindu Brahmins at the expense of underprivileged castes? Or oppressed castes?
Absolutely. Yeah, I can say some things about this. So Hindu phobia, and this idea of Hindu phobia, sort of piggybacks on the framework of Islamophobia and suggests that Hindus suffer from some sort of systemic discrimination, but it's particularly deployed in the West, where that's just not the case. Hindus absolutely, as I said in my comments earlier, suffer from incidents of anti-Hindu hate as well as racist hate. They are victims of white supremacy, just like many other marginalized and people of color. But there is no systemic discrimination against Hindus. That is just not a thing. Hindus represent one of the wealthiest liberal minorities in the US. They are, 89% of Hindus voted for Barack Obama. 73% of Hindus and South Asian Americans voted for Joe Biden. These are people who largely also hold economic privilege. And many of them, I would say the majority of them that have immigrated to the United States are from dominant caste groups because of the advantages that they had in education and economics in India. Right. So my own family, and I always put my own positionality first, right, are Tamil Brahmins. We were given a number of educational privileges. That's the only reason my parents were able to emigrate here. Right. So when the charge of Hindu phobia is made, it's not just about this idea that Hindus suffer particular hate, but it erases and it absolves Hindus of having to deal with the Islamophobia that is rampant in their communities, not to mention the anti-Black sentiment that is also a problem in South Asian communities. They don't have to contend with that because instead they'll make the argument that as Hindus, they are an oppressed minority. And that is precisely, if I may draw our attention back to these two professors who levied this lawsuit, right? They filed this lawsuit. This is precisely the kind of argument they're making. They're suggesting that they are going to be at risk, and they're not considering the kinds of risk that they put Dalit students or caste oppressed groups at risk, the kind of risk that they're putting them at by sort of not acknowledging this. And I'll say one other thing. The same Hindu Savarnas that, for example, do things like invite people to pool parties just to see if they're wearing a jannu, right? Or invite people out to lunch to see what they're ordering for lunch. This is forms of casteism that people don't often recognize, right? You don't know that you're going to do that. Or they'll ask you about where you're from, what's your family background, right? These seem like innocuous questions, but they're not innocuous, correct? Right? So that is precisely how we see them. And then they'll claim Hindu phobia and argue that this is the problem, right? But they will never, ever consider how this itself, these kinds of questions are actually a violence on those communities.
I appreciate that in-depth take on this very complicated matter. Thank you so much, Dr. Sundaram. I have a question here for Anilji. I think you would be best suited to answer this. How can HR departments for organizations/companies in the US be trained to implement anti-caste discrimination policy and address cases of caste discrimination?
Yeah, thank you for that question. But I want to weigh in on the earlier question that
Of
we
course.
talked about, whether the courts will kind of get the prominence for this issue. I think the Department of Fair Housing and Employment, the department now renamed as a California Civil Rights Department, they should get a fair bit of credit for the case that they brought in, despite caste not being explicitly mentioned in statute anywhere. And many other civil rights departments are now in the process of learning as to how this caste operates. We, Ambedkar International Center, spoke with New Jersey Civil Rights Department and other departments also. There is a lot of responsibility, and we must congratulate and thank the Department of Fair Housing and Employment, renamed as the Civil Rights Department. Of course, the courts have indeed taken a note of things. The protection, that is protection of anonymity provided to the victims of sexual violence, is now suggested to be provided to the victims of caste violence as well. So the courts are also now slowly going to recognize. HR departments is a tough luck because many of these prominent positions are held in HR by the Savarna people. That's the when I talked about where I was invited and I was kind of shunted out. It's a very tough luck to talk to HR departments. Again, the American universities have taken a bold step in recognizing caste, and usually the universities are like citadels of liberal thoughts, and they are kind of guiding torch to the society. So HR departments will have a lot of work to do. They have to be really ready for the backlash that they will invite. I recently spoke, a couple of weeks ago, at another Indian multinational IT company, and the backlash that they received, which we came to know a little later, was tremendous. They simply didn't anticipate that kind of backlash. So first of all, HR departments will have to take the courage to talk these difficult subjects, and these are difficult subjects. Every time we try to break a new ground, whether it will be Black rights or whether it is LGBTQ, these are the new grounds that we need to break. Society has been shunning these people for ages, and to bring them, to assimilate them, it's not going to be easy. There are going to be backlash and so on. So HR departments can only kind of gear up, take the courage, take the issues head on, and prepare for the worst.
Thank you so much, Anilji. Dr. Brown, do you also want to comment on that?
Yeah, I do want to make a quick comment. I understand that most of this conversation is taking place within the South Asian community in the US. But you are focusing on this conversation as if it was something going on in India. The United States has a history of having dealt with the caste system. If you're talking to the history with African Americans is much greater, and I certainly don't have time to talk about it here. But if you're talking to white Americans, you can talk to white Americans because they've heard of the concept of caste in terms of race. And when the concept of caste was first used in the US, the entire 19th century, it was the dominant concept of the way you talked about race discrimination. And the understanding there were the Brahmins are oppressing everyone else. So there is this historical memory in the United States of the oppressive aspect of the caste system of India. What we're dealing with right now is a turn that starts to take place at the beginning of the 20th century, where we start to talk about white supremacy, as opposed to the comparison of the Black struggle to the Indian caste system. So another way to do it is say, look, your meaning talking to white Americans, your country has long recognized the oppressive aspect of the caste system. Go back to your thinking in the 19th century, because that sets the context where you can talk about how the upper caste oppresses caste oppressed people. In other words, what I'm saying is there is a historical memory here in the United States that allows you to make your arguments. You just got to call on that historical memory.
Dr. Brown, thank you for that fantastic point. I do think that we, as a collective, tend to forget the longstanding relationship between these two very similar civil rights movements. So I'm glad you bring that up. I want to end kind of on that note, and I'll open this up to all of our panelists once again. I'll speak as a Muslim Indian who grew up in America. I honestly, I knew that caste existed. I knew it was still practiced, but I did not know the how deeply it ran in the diaspora. In fact, I grew up thinking like very genuinely that you couldn't tell caste from a surname. And I see now like I was very much wrong, and I didn't learn this till college. So I would like to know, like, what can allies and people from, within the Indian diaspora who are not Hindu, and as well as people who might be Black Americans, white Americans, any other, like Asian Americans, how can they help contribute to alliance with the Dalit community and fight against casteism in the United States in a more productive manner?
So I can start. So there are, so as kind of also Deepa had mentioned, and I tried to allude to, so there's the issue of historically communities having converted out of Hinduism in order to escape the caste system. But then, of course, it actually just kind of traveled, and there's casteism in Islam, within the Christian community, with Sikhs. So there are still kind of like segregated prayer spaces. And there's, in the Muslim community, there are Pasmanda Muslims who are the equivalent of Dalits for the Hindu community, who have written a lot about how caste in Islam functions. There's Ravidasas from the Sikh community who have written about how, who are the equivalent again of like the Dalit community and the Sikh community. So I think there's a lot in terms of literature to be able to access, and there's YouTube videos and all types of platforms. In the US, at least we have definitely all around the country, there are different Ambedkarite organizations. So Ambedkar International Center, ANA, AIM, and BSG, and I run a Dalit Art Collective. So I think that probably plugging into any one of those based on where you live is also a good way to get connected. And I think that also amongst, at least between all these groups, there's probably at least 4,000 to 5,000 of us, collectively in the US that are politically, that are kind of, have been politicized because there's also a large amount of our people from the community who haven't had access to this type of education. So I would say that, I see that the conversations are kind of held among a few intellectuals or whomever, and I think we just need to broaden that, like for everyone to learn, for everyone to be able to speak on this, and then to access different voices from the community is super important, instead of trying to concentrate it on like, well, this, because we don't want this to become like a, like one person or two people representing, Dalit people are like 250 million people. So there's a lot, and that's just in India itself. So that's not even counting South Asia. So we just need we need to encourage each other. We need to grow each other, and then listen to voices from the community and plug into the Ambedkarite groups. Thank you so much, Safa.
Thank you so much, Dolly. Anyone else that would like to chime in on this? Anilji, Deepa.
No, like Isabel Wilkerson says that the caste is the bone and the race is the skin. That's what Professor Kevin Brown was also suggesting, that it all starts with the caste. And now the race conversation has taken so much, as if now we need to invent caste and try to fit it into the race conversation, whereas the caste precedes racism way, way back.
Amazing point. Dr. Sundaram, would you like to comment on this as well?
I just wanted to affirm everything Dolly said, because I think that's really the place we need to go. And I would say, being able to, as a professor, and those of us that teach, putting Dalit authors and making sure that people are reading these scholars. And I also actually spent a lot of time putting Dalit organizations in front of my students, because I think we often forget that these organizations are existing, and they're doing really important solidarity work with other groups that haven't traditionally had a lot of speaking power in the US, like Black Lives Matter, and groups that are associated with that, but also progressive Jewish organizations that are fighting against anti-Semitism, progressive Muslim organizations, right? So there's a lot of really important on the ground grassroots solidarity work that's being done that people can participate in. I put a couple of resources in the chat, and the organization that I co-founded with a bunch of folks, the South Asia Scholar Activist Collective, has a field manual that we have included a number of resources specifically thinking about the intersections of caste, oppression, as well as Hindu phobia, and sort of how these things work in terms of the Hindu nationalist sort of global threat that we're all facing, but also how it intersects with things like white supremacy. So I think those are spaces. And in Canada, there's Sadan, and that's a fantastic organization. And I just want to make a shout out to my good friend Yashika Dutt and her work coming out as Dalit, which is a very readable text, and not only talks about growing up in India, but also really connects that to sort of the global, issue of caste and sort of how it operates more broadly. I think reading more, to add to what Dolly said, which I actually think is pretty comprehensive, is just having people read more and really putting this in front of them. One last thing I'll say is that I think literacy among politicians and community organizers is really important, about understanding how not to be sort of fooled by the Hindu phobia narrative, which is really a narrative that's employed to sort of, mask anti-Blackness, anti-Muslim sentiment, casteism, right? All of those things, and really, again, position Hindus as a vulnerable group always. Simran and I wrote about this, but, we pointed out that just because you are vulnerable, that doesn't mean you can't participate in oppression. And it's really important for people to recognize that, but it's such a nuanced point, right? And so having the kind of literacy that we need, and one of the things that I know that Thane Marie is trying to do at Equality Labs, but I would love to see, is more of a media guide that tells reporters how to report on this. I myself have given interviews and get taken out of context, and that gets weaponized by Hindu right organizations. And then you're just kind of where you are again. This is such a difficult issue for people who are not in the thick of things to understand. And having a good media guide is something that I would love to see kind of come out of one of an Ambedkarite or Dalit organization in particular. Okay. I'm sorry, took up too much.
No, don't apologize. I thank you all of our panelists, for your incredible insights and for breaking down this issue for us in so much detail. huge kudos to all of your amazing work. I hope our attendees will continue to support all of you and also all of these amazing Dalit organizations and activists that we've mentioned so far. I would like to give a huge shout out to the co-organizers of this briefing, which include Genocide Watch, World Without Genocide, Indian American Muslim Council, Hindus for Human Rights, International Christian Concern, Jubilee Campaign, 21 Wilberforce, Dalit Solidarity Forum, New York State Council of Churches, Federation of Indian American Christian Organizations of North America, India Civil Watch International, Center for Pluralism, American Muslim Institution, Students Against Hindutva Ideology, International Society for Peace and Justice, the Humanism Project, and Association of Indian Muslims of America. Thank you so much, everyone, for tuning in.